The sun had already begun its slow bleed across the Kansas horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and deep rose, when Aaron Collier first saw her, and something inside his chest shifted in a way that had nothing to do with the long ride behind him, and everything to do with the woman swinging that hoe like she was fighting the earth itself into submission. He had been riding the trail from Dodge City for the better part of 2 days, heading south toward the Cimarron River country, where a cattle drive contract waited for him, one that would pay well enough to finally put something aside instead of watching his wages disappear into feed bills and saddle repairs. His horse, a solid bay gelding he called Ranger, had slowed to a lazy walk, sensing that the end of the day was near, and Aaron had let him set the pace along the rutted dirt road that wound past a stretch of fenced farmland somewhere outside the small settlement of Caldwell, Kansas, in the dry summer of 1879. The field was not large, maybe 4 acres planted in corn, with rows that had clearly been tended by careful hands over a long season. The stalks stood tall and green in the late July heat, but the ground between them had hardened and cracked in the drought that had gripped southern Kansas for the past 3 weeks, and someone had been working it with a hoe to break up the soil around the roots so the plants could breathe and draw what little moisture remained below the surface. That someone was Hester Rhodes. She was tall for a woman, with broad shoulders that spoke of years of real labor, and her dark hair had mostly escaped from the braid it had started the day in, trailing loose strands across the back of her neck and sticking to her temples with sweat. Her dress was practical calico, faded from washing, its sleeves rolled to the elbow to show forearms that were tanned and strong. She worked with a rhythm that was almost musical, the hoe rising and falling in steady strokes, and she did not look up when Aaron drew his horse even with the fence line, because she was concentrating, because the row was long, and because she had probably learned a long time ago that looking up every time you heard hoofbeats cost you more work than it was worth. Aaron watched her for a moment longer than he intended to. There was something about the way she moved that stopped him completely, not just the physical grace of it, but the sheer determination behind it. The sky was going orange now, the kind of orange that meant darkness was not far behind, and this woman was still in her field alone, still working, with nobody alongside her and nobody visible at the farmhouse some distance back from the road. A farmhouse that, he noticed, had a chimney that was not smoking, a small lean-to barn with only one horse visible inside it through the open door, and a gate that was hanging slightly off one of its hinges. He did not think about it at length. He was not the kind of man who deliberated over the right thing to do as though it required extended consideration. He just pulled Ranger to a stop, swung down from the saddle, looped the reins around the top post of the fence rail without being asked, took off his hat, hung it on the saddle horn, and ducked through the fence rails into the field. Hester heard him before she saw him, and she straightened up fast, turning with the hoe in both hands in a posture that was not exactly threatening, but was not exactly welcoming either. Because a woman alone on a farm in 1879, Kansas, had to be ready for the fact that not every stranger who stopped was stopping for good reasons. She looked at him with brown eyes that were sharp and direct, and had no patience in them for anything foolish. He was taller than she had expected, with a lean, weathered face that had been outdoors long enough to have permanent lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into the sun. His hair was dark brown under the impression left by his hat. His hands were the kind of big and callous that came from years of rope work and cattle handling, and he was looking at her with an expression that was straightforward and quiet, not the smirking, calculating look she had learned to be wary of from strangers passing through. "I am not looking for trouble," he said simply, holding his hands out briefly to show them empty. "I am Aaron Collier. I was riding past and I could see the ground is hard and there is a lot of row left and it is getting dark. If you will tell me where you keep another hoe, I will work the other end and we can meet in the middle." Hester stared at him for a long, steady moment. "I did not ask for help," she said. "No," he agreed. "You did not." Another pause. The wind moved through the corn stalks around them with a sound like dry whispering, and somewhere out past the barn, a meadowlark was singing its last song of the evening. Hester looked at him, and he looked at her, and something in his expression was patient in a way that was completely genuine, the patience of a man who was not trying to impress her or persuade her, but was simply stating a fact about what he intended to do if she allowed it. "Lean-to, south wall," she said finally, and turned back to her row. He found the hoe exactly where she had indicated, a good solid tool with a worn but sound handle, and he went to the far end of the same row she was working and began from the other direction. He worked the way he did everything physical, with efficient, unhurried strokes that covered ground steadily without burning out. The soil was hard, just as he had thought from the road, dry clear through and needing to be broken apart and mounded up around the base of each plant to hold any dew that might come in the night. They worked toward each other as the sky deepened from orange to deep violet, and by the time they met in the middle of the row, the first stars were beginning to appear. Neither of them said anything for a moment, standing there in the dimming corn with their hoes in their hands and a row of turned earth stretching away in both directions. "Thank you," Hester said, and her voice had shifted slightly, the wariness still in it but something else now too, something more open. "How many more rows?" Aaron asked. "Two, but it is getting dark." "Then let us get a lantern." She looked at him again, that same steady measuring look. "You have somewhere to be, Mr. Collier. People do not just stop." "I am heading to the Cimarron," he said. "Nothing there that will not wait for morning." Hester Rhodes had not asked a stranger to stay in 3 years, not since her husband Martin had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1876, leaving her with 80 acres, a modest debt at the bank in Caldwell, a milch cow, 1 horse, and their daughter Clara, who was 6 years old now and already had her father's quiet stubbornness and her mother's eyes. Hester had kept the farm. She had paid down the debt by selling cream and eggs and taking in mending from the town wives, and she had planted and harvested and done everything that needed doing without asking a soul for anything, because asking meant owing, and she had decided she could not afford to owe anything to anyone. But she had 2 rows left in the dark, and her hands were already blistered, and the man standing across from her had an honest face. She got the lantern. They finished the remaining 2 rows in the soft gold of the kerosene light, working in a companionable silence that felt less strange as the minutes passed. And by the time the last plant had been properly hilled, Hester's back was aching and her hands were tight with fatigue, and she was grateful in a way that she would not have put into words, but that showed in the set of her shoulders when she finally straightened up completely and let out a long breath. "I have leftover bean soup and cornbread," she said, not quite looking at him. "It is not much." "It sounds like a good meal," Aaron said. The farmhouse was small and plain and clean, with the particular cleanliness of a home where one person was trying very hard to manage everything on their own, and had decided that order was something that cost nothing to maintain. A small table, 2 chairs and a child-sized stool, a cast-iron stove, shelves of carefully labeled preserves along one wall, a braided rug that had been made from scraps of clothing, a tin of wildflowers on the windowsill that was clearly the work of a child's enthusiastic gathering. Clara was asleep in the small back room, and Hester spoke quietly as she ladled soup into 2 bowls and sliced cornbread. She told him, because it seemed only right to explain the situation to a man who had just spent an hour in her field, that she ran the farm alone, that her hired hand had left in June when a better wage had come along, that this summer's drought had been harder than most, and that she fully expected to manage. Aaron listened to all of this with his elbows on the table and his hat set on his knee, and he ate the soup, which was excellent despite her disclaimer, and he did not offer opinions she had not asked for or suggestions she had not requested. He just listened and asked a question when she fell quiet and listened some more, and Hester found herself talking more than she had intended to, the words coming out slightly surprised by their own existence, as though they had been waiting a long time for someone to be genuinely interested in hearing them. "Where are you headed after the Cimarron?" she asked finally, partly to redirect the conversation, and partly because she found herself wanting to know. "After the drive." "I do not know yet," he said honestly. "I have been making it as I go for a few years now, working drives, working ranches. It suits me." "Does it?" He considered this. "I used to think so. Now I am less sure." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight, and something about that admission, its quietness, its lack of self-pity, made her feel that she was seeing something real about him. He slept in the barn, as was proper and expected, on a blanket he carried in his bedroll, and Ranger was glad enough for the company of the farm horse, an aging dun named Pepper, and stood companionably in the adjacent stall. In the morning, Aaron was up before the sun, and had already fed both horses and brought in fresh water from the well before Hester came out to start the morning chores. She stood in the barn doorway holding a lantern and looked at him with an expression that mixed surprise with something that might have been the beginning of gratitude if she had let herself feel it fully. "I was going to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "The cow needs milking still." She milked the cow. Aaron fixed the barn gate hinge that had been pulling loose. He found the tools he needed hanging on the barn wall without asking where they were, which she noticed, because it meant he understood how a working farm was organized without needing to be taught, which meant he had grown up with one or worked one long enough to know. Then he replaced 2 fence rails at the northeast corner that had been leaning badly, and while he worked, Clara appeared in the yard in her nightgown with her hair in a wild tangle, staring at him with the frank, unguarded curiosity of a 6-year-old who had seen very little of the world outside this farm and was interested in everything about it. "Who are you?" Clara asked. "Aaron Collier. Who are you?" "Clara Rhodes. Why are you fixing our fence?" "Because it was broken." Clara considered this answer with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "Can you fix the step on the porch too? Mama keeps saying she will get to it." "Clara," Hester said from behind her, in the tone of a mother who has appeared at exactly the right moment. "It is a reasonable request," Aaron said, and his mouth curved at the corner and he looked at Hester when he said it, and she felt that small smile land somewhere in her chest before she was ready for it. He fixed the porch step. He shared breakfast. He should have saddled Ranger and ridden on before the sun was fully up, and he knew it, and he did not quite manage to do it. Hester watched him go when he finally did leave. Late in the morning with the sun already climbing, standing on the porch, he had repaired with her arms folded across her chest and her expression carefully neutral. He raised a hand from the saddle and she gave a small nod, and then she went back to work, because there was always work, and she had already spent more time thinking about Aaron Collier than was sensible. She kept thinking about him anyway. The cattle drive to the Cimarron country took Aaron 3 weeks, and they were long, brutal, dusty weeks in the heat of late summer, pushing a herd of 800 longhorns south across the parched Kansas flats with 5 other trail hands, and a trail boss named Walt Greer who was fair, but expected everything done exactly right, and did not hesitate to say so at volume when it was not. Aaron was good at the work, genuinely good at it, the kind of man who moved through the chaos of a cattle drive with an almost instinctive understanding of where the cattle wanted to go and how to redirect them without causing a panic. He could read the herd the way some men read books. But in the evenings, around the campfire after supper when the other hands were playing cards or trading stories, he found himself thinking about a field of corn in the last of the daylight, and dark hair loose against a tan neck, and brown eyes that were sharp and honest and had made him feel, for the first time in a long time, that he was being seen as a person rather than just a hired hand passing through. He thought about the farm and its clear signs of struggle kept carefully quiet. The one horse, the patched fences, the missing hired hand, the way she had said she fully expected to manage with a conviction that told him she was not entirely certain, but had decided to act as though she were because she had no other option. He thought about Clara and her direct questions and the wildflowers in the tin on the windowsill. He had not set out to be thinking about any of this. He had just stopped by a fence. On the 23rd day, when the drive was done and the cattle were counted and his wages were paid, instead of heading north toward Dodge City as he had vaguely planned, he found himself turning Ranger's nose northeast, back toward Caldwell. He told himself he was just passing through. He repeated this to himself several times as he rode. He was not sure either of them believed it. He came back on an afternoon in late August, when the heat was still fierce and the country around Caldwell looked as dry and golden as old paper. He came back without any particular plan, beyond seeing that the farm was all right, which he understood was not entirely a logical reason for a man to ride 2 days out of his way, but was the reason nonetheless. The corn had been harvested. He could tell from the road that the rows had been picked clean, the stalks standing stripped and beginning to droop, and that she had done it as she did everything herself. He rode up the lane to the farmhouse and stopped in the yard, and Hester came out of the house with a dish towel in her hands and stopped on the porch and looked at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "You came back," she said. "I was heading through," he said. She looked at him for a long moment with that measuring look that he was already beginning to know. "Were you?" she said, in a tone that made it not quite a question. He got down from Ranger. He stayed for a week that time, sleeping in the barn and earning his keep by doing the accumulated work that needed 2 hands and had been waiting for 2 hands. He cleaned out the linta properly and repaired the roof section that had been leaking, replaced the rope on the well, rehung the cellar door that swung crooked, and turned the soil on the kitchen garden so it could rest for fall. He worked alongside Hester when she was working and got out of her way when she wanted to work alone, because he had already understood that she valued her competence and did not want it crowded, and he respected that without needing to say so. Clara had adopted him immediately and without reservation, the way children do when they have decided they like someone, and see no reason to complicate the matter with adult caution. She showed him her collection of interesting rocks, explained at considerable length the character flaws of the neighbor's dog, who sometimes came onto their land and frightened the chickens, and sat beside him at meals with the satisfied air of someone who had arranged things exactly as she wanted them. In the evenings, when Clara was in bed, Aaron and Hester sat on the repaired porch in the cooling dark and talked. They talked about everything and nothing in the particular way that 2 people talk when they are finding out who each other is, the stories underneath the story, the things that made a person into who they had become. He told her about growing up on a Missouri farm before his family had lost it in the financial crashes of the early 1870s, about drifting west, about the years on the trail. She told him about coming to Kansas from Ohio as a bride of 20, about building the farm with Martin, about the winter he had died, and the way the world had contracted down to the size of this land and this child, and the absolute necessity of keeping both of them. "Was angry," she said one evening looking out at the dark field. "For a long time I was angry at him for dying, which is not a reasonable thing to feel." "It is a completely reasonable thing to feel," Aaron said quietly. She looked at him. "He did not choose to die." "No, but you still had to carry everything afterward, and anger is the first thing that comes when the weight is more than one person ought to carry alone." She was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Yes, that is exactly it." He left again at the end of the week, because there was a short-term ranch job near Wellington that he had heard about from a passing rider, and he needed the wages, and also because he was aware that staying indefinitely without any clear arrangement or understanding would not be fair to Hester, who had her reputation in this community and her own careful sense of what was right. But before he saddled Ranger on the morning of his departure, he asked her something. "Would it be all right if I came back again?" Yes. She was standing in the morning sun with her arms crossed and her chin up slightly in that way she had when she was deciding something, and she looked at him steadily and said, "It would be all right." He rode to Wellington with a feeling in his chest that was unfamiliar and warm, and made the entire 3-day journey feel shorter than it was. The ranch job near Wellington lasted 6 weeks, and they were busy weeks, repairing line fences and moving cattle to winter pasture, the kind of sustained, physical work that he was good at and that ordinarily satisfied him. This time it did not quite settle him the way it usually did. He kept finding his mind returning to the farm outside Caldwell, to the small porch in the dark, to brown eyes that looked at him like they were actually seeing him. He wrote her a letter. He sat with a borrowed pencil and a piece of paper in the bunkhouse one evening and wrote her an actual letter, which was not something he had done in years, because there had not been anyone to write to. He wrote about the Wellington country, about a dust storm that had rolled through in the second week and lasted 2 days, about a particular horse on the ranch that he had made progress with that nobody else had managed. He kept it straightforward and honest and did not put into it the things he was feeling that were more than he was ready to say, because those felt like things that needed to be said in person, not on paper. She wrote back. Her letter came to him at the ranch 3 weeks later, forwarded from a post office in Wellington, and he read it twice sitting on a fence rail in the October afternoon. She wrote about the fall preparations, about putting up the last of the preserves, about a dispute she had heard about at the general store in Caldwell between 2 neighboring farms over a water right that was getting ugly enough that people were talking about lawyers and possibly worse. She wrote about Clara, who had started at the school in town and had immediately made 2 friends and 1 enemy, and had described all 3 to her mother in exhaustive detail. At the end of the letter, in the same straightforward way she did everything, she wrote, "I find I am looking forward to seeing you again, which is something I did not expect to say about anyone, so I thought it was fair to tell you." He folded the letter very carefully and kept it in his breast pocket for the rest of his time at the ranch. He came back in November, this time with his full wages in his pocket and a clear intention that went beyond passing through, and he knew it, and he thought she probably knew it too. The Kansas plains had gone cold and gray by then, the fields bare and frost stiffened, and Hester was wearing a heavy shawl when she came out onto the porch and saw him ride up the lane. Her face did something complicated when she saw him, something that started controlled and settled almost immediately into a warmth she did not try very hard to hide. "Mr. Collier," she said. "Miss Rhodes," he said, though they both knew it was technically Mrs. Rhodes, and the slight adjustment in the form of address meant something, and they both knew that too. He sat at her table that evening and told her directly, the way he did things, that he had been thinking about her since July, and that he wanted, if she was willing, to spend more time here and see what might come of that. He was not making any kind of declaration yet, he said, because that would be getting ahead of himself, but he wanted to be honest about his intentions rather than just keep showing up. Hester looked at him across the table for a long moment. Then she said, "I have Clara to think about. I know that she would always come first, that is how it should be. I have this farm, it is mine, I worked for it. Yes, you did, and it is yours. I am not looking for someone to take things over," she said carefully. "I need to know that is understood." "I understand it," he said. "I am not looking to take anything over. I am looking to help carry some of it if you will let me." She looked at him. The lamplight was warm between them, and outside the November wind was coming across the flats with a low, steady voice. "All right," she said. "Let us see what comes of it." What came of it was a winter of careful and genuine discovery, of 2 people learning each other the way a person learns new country, not all at once but steadily, with attention. Aaron did not move into the farmhouse. He kept his sleeping arrangements in the barn proper, which was warmer than it might have been once he chinked the gaps in the walls, and added a better stove pipe to the small wood-burning stove that was already there, and which maintained the absolute propriety that Hester needed for the sake of her standing in the community, which she had built carefully and did not intend to have questioned by the neighbors. but he was there every day, working the farm alongside her, learning its particular rhythms and needs, and in the evenings they sat by the kitchen stove and talked or read, or sat in companionable quiet, which is one of the most intimate things two people can do. Clara continued to treat Aaron as a settled and welcome feature of the household, bringing him problems and questions with complete trust, and he responded to every single one of these with the same genuine seriousness, not talking down or brushing off, but actually engaging with whatever she brought him. When she had a difficulty at school with an older boy who was saying unkind things, he listened to the whole story, and then told her that some people acted that way because they had not been taught better, and that the best thing she could do was be exactly who she was, and let his unkindness be entirely his own problem, which was advice she clearly found useful, because she came back a week later to report that she had tried it and it had worked. And she told him this with the satisfaction of a scientist confirming a hypothesis. The water rights dispute that Hester had mentioned in her letter escalated through the winter into something more serious. The two neighboring farms involved were the Bauer property, a large and prosperous operation to the north, and the much smaller Whitfield homestead, and the argument was over a creek that ran between them, the Bauers claiming the right to divert it for their new field expansion, the Whitfields arguing that this would leave their east pasture without water. The argument had gone from words to property damage on at least one occasion, with someone cutting a fence, and the county sheriff had been out twice. Hester was not directly involved, but the dispute made everyone in the area tense, because water in a dry year was not a small matter, and when farmers started cutting fences and making accusations, the feeling in the community shifted. Aaron rode over to the Whitfield place one afternoon in December with Hester, who knew the family, and they spent an afternoon talking it through with old Ned Whitfield and his son James. Aaron had no legal standing to advise anyone, but he had seen enough water disputes in his years riding the range to know how they generally went, and he suggested quietly that getting an actual surveyor to come out and document the creek's course and historical flow would probably help their case more than any amount of argument, and that making sure there was never any question about whether they had initiated any of the property damage was important. Whether this advice was taken or not, the dispute eventually settled the following spring when the county judge ruled in a way that gave both parties partial rights and neither party everything they wanted, which was probably the most honest possible resolution. Nobody cut any more fences after that. The winter deep-dived into the genuine cold of a Kansas January, with ice on the water troughs every morning and frost that turned the fields silver in the pre-dawn. And Hester and Aaron worked through it with the kind of partnership that comes from two people who have figured out how to move around each other without friction, who hand things across without needing to ask where they are, who work and rest in the same natural rhythm. On the coldest nights, Clara slept between her mother's bed and the kitchen stove, wrapped in every quilt in the house, and Hester would sometimes look across the kitchen at Aaron doing something practical and ordinary like sharpening a blade or mending a piece of harness, and she would feel something catch in her throat that she had not felt in so long that it took her a moment to name it. She named it eventually. It was happiness. Simple, quiet, unexpected happiness. It was on a night in late January, with a blizzard working itself up outside and the kitchen warm and close and safe, that things shifted between them in the direction they had been moving since July. Clara was long asleep, bundled under her quilts in the back room, and Hester and Aaron were at the kitchen table with a lamp between them and a pot of coffee going cold because neither of them had reached for it in a while, and Hester had been talking about something. She could not afterward have said exactly what, and she had said something that made him laugh, genuinely laugh, not a polite sound but the real thing, and she had looked at him laughing in the lamplight and her heart had simply opened up. The way a fist opens when it finally lets go of something it has been holding too long. "Aaron," she said. He stopped laughing and looked at her, and he saw something in her face that he had been very careful not to push toward, had let it come at its own pace because he understood this was not a woman you rushed. You did not rush Hester Rhodes toward anything. You made your intentions clear and then you waited and let her decide. And now she had decided. "Hester," he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. It was one of those moments that is small and enormous at the same time. A woman putting her hand over a man's on a table in a warm kitchen, while a blizzard pushed against the glass outside, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that for a long while, neither of them needing to say anything more right then. February came and went in the particular slow brutality of a plains winter, and March came in with the promise of mud, and then delivered on that promise comprehensively, and through all of it the two of them continued to discover each other. They argued once, over something practical about the farm plan for spring planting, with Aaron suggesting a different crop rotation than Hester had in mind, and Hester telling him in no uncertain terms that she had been farming this land for 6 years and knew its soil better than any pattern in a book, and Aaron saying that was fair enough, and meaning it, and deferring to her judgment, and the argument being over in 20 minutes with no residue on either side. They were both people who did not hold on to things once they were settled, which was fortunate. He kissed her for the first time on a Sunday afternoon in March, in the kitchen garden where she was planning out where the spring beds would go, pointing and explaining and gesturing in a way that was completely unself-conscious, and he had been watching her and listening, and at some point the listening had become not listening at all but simply looking at her, and she had looked up mid-sentence and seen his face and stopped talking, and he had said, "May I?" And she had said, "Yes." And it was the most honest exchange in the world, and what followed from it was exactly as honest, warm and unhurried and real. Clara, it turned out, had been hoping for this development for some time and received the news of it, when Hester told her carefully and seriously that Aaron was someone very important to her now, with the triumphant expression of a 6-year-old who has seen something coming that the adults thought they were hiding. "I knew that," Clara said. "He looks at you the way Pepper looks at fresh hay." Hester put her hand over her face and Aaron laughed until he had to sit down. Spring came fully in April, and with it the full weight of the farming year, planting time in a season that was already being predicted to be drier than last year by the almanac and wetter than last year by the old-timers, which meant nobody actually knew, and so Hester planted what she knew would stand up to either. Aaron was fully invested in the work now, not as a hand following orders but as a genuine partner, understanding that the decisions were hers to make, and that his role was to bring information and labor, and to support whatever she decided. They worked long days and came in tired and sat at the table together, and that simple shared tiredness at the end of a hard day was its own form of intimacy. There was a Saturday in late April that changed things again, in the particular way that one afternoon can change the shape of a life if it holds the right conversation. Aaron had ridden into Caldwell for supplies, and Hester had given him the list in her careful household money, and he had done the errands and was loading the supplies onto the pack horse when he ran into a man named Glenn Parr outside the general store, a man he had worked a drive with 2 years prior, who greeted him with the hearty surprise of someone who had not expected to see a person in a particular place. "Aaron Collier," Glenn said, "I heard you were working this country. I have a proposition for you. We are putting together a drive in June, 3,000 head up through the nations to Abilene. Griggs is putting it together and he pays well, you know that. I need a good segundo. That is you if you want it." Second in command on a drive that size was real money, the kind of money Aaron had not seen in a while. The offer sat in his mind all the way back to the farm, and he was quiet at supper, which Hester noticed because she noticed everything about him now, the way a person does when they have opened their heart to someone. "What is it?" she asked, after Clara had gone to bed. He told her about the offer. All of it, including the money, including what that kind of money could mean. And then he said the part that mattered. "I will not take it if you need me here. This is the planting season and I will not leave you short-handed. I want to know what you think." Hester was quiet for a moment looking at the lamp. Then she said, "How long would you be gone?" 3 months, maybe a bit more. 3 months was a long time during a farming season, but she had managed before and they both knew it. "The money would help," she said carefully. "Would it help you, or would it just be money that passes through?" He understood what she was asking. She was asking what he intended to do with it, what he was building toward. And the answer was there in him, had been there for a while, and he said it the way he did things, directly and without decoration. "I would like to use some of it toward this farm, with your permission, not to take anything over, but to invest in it alongside you if that is something you would consider." She looked at him for a long time. "That is a large thing to consider." "Yes," he said, "it is." "Are you asking me something specific, Aaron?" He got up from his chair and came around the table and crouched down beside her chair so they were at eye level, and he took her hands and held them carefully, as though they were something valuable, which to him they were, calloused and strong, and the hands that had kept this farm alive through things that would have broken a great many people. "I am asking you if you would be willing to let me make a life here with you," he said. "With you and Clara. I am not looking for a transaction. I am asking if you would marry me, Hester, if that is something you want." She looked at him for a very long time in the quiet kitchen, with the lamp burning between them and the spring night making its soft sounds outside, and he waited the way he always waited, without pressure, letting her be exactly who she was. "I want it," she said. "Yes." He put his forehead against her hands and held very still for a moment, and she put her other hand gently on the top of his head, and they stayed like that in the lamp-quiet kitchen for a while before either of them spoke again. They told Clara the next morning at breakfast. Clara sat with her spoon suspended over her porridge and looked at the two of them, and then at the ceiling, and then back at them with an expression of complete vindication. "Finally," she said. Hester felt the laugh start in her throat before she could stop it, and Aaron was already smiling his real smile, the one that went all the way to his eyes, and something in the quality of the morning light coming through the kitchen window seemed brighter than it had been before, which was not logical and was completely true. Aaron took the drive. He left in the first week of June with Ranger freshly shod, and his gear in order, and a proper goodbye that was not said in front of Clara, because it was the kind of goodbye that needed some privacy, the kind with their foreheads together, and her hands on his face, and words that were meant only for the two of them. He told her he would write, and he did, every week when he could get a letter to a post office, and she wrote back to addresses he had given her along the route, and some of the letters reached him on the trail, and some waited for him at Abilene, and they were all, on both sides, letters that said the real things without apology. The summer without him was harder than she wanted to admit, and easier than she had feared. She had Clara, who was a genuine presence in the house and the yard, old enough now to be genuinely helpful with the smaller tasks, and honest enough about the larger ones to tell her mother when something was more than she could manage. Hester had also, without quite planning it, allowed more of a connection to the neighbors than she had in the past years of her proud solitude. Margaret Hoskins from the farm 2 miles east had started coming by on Sundays with her children, and the Whitfield women had proven to be good company now that the water dispute was resolved, and Hester discovered that the community she had kept slightly at arm's length was actually full of people who were glad to know her when she let them. There was a difficult week in July when Pepper, the old farm horse, took a fever that she was not sure he would come through, and she sat up 2 nights with him and gave him what remedies she had, and sent a note to the nearest farmer who had experience with horses. The horse pulled through, elderly and stubborn as he was, and she wrote Aaron about it, and his response when it reached her made her laugh and cry simultaneously, because he wrote about his relief for Pepper in the same breath that he wrote about his relief that she had not been alone in it. In Abilene at the end of August, Aaron received his wages, which were everything Glen Parr had promised and then some, because Griggs paid a bonus when a drive came in under time and over numbers, and this one had. He sent a money order to a Caldwell bank on Hester's account, not a huge amount, but enough to be meaningful, and included a note with it saying that this was toward the farm, and that he would explain the rest when he arrived. He also, in Abilene, visited the office of a justice of the peace and made a formal inquiry about what would be required for a legal marriage in Kansas, and received that information and put it in his pocket alongside the bank receipt. He came home in September in the last warmth of the year, with the sky that particular blue that only happens in the plains in early fall, enormous and clear and deep, and he rode up the lane in the late afternoon with the light falling golden across the field, and the farmhouse, and the woman who was standing on the porch with her arms crossed, and her face doing that complicated thing it did when she was feeling more than she was prepared to show, except that now it showed anyway. Clara came running across the yard at full speed, in a way that made clear she had been watching the road, and hit him around the middle before he had fully dismounted, and he caught her and swung her up, and she told him approximately 7 things simultaneously, about school, and the neighbors and Pepper's illness and recovery, and a bird nest she had found in the old apple tree, and he listened to all 7 things at once with complete attention. Then he set her down and walked up to the porch, and Hester stepped down off it to meet him, and he put his arms around her and held her with his chin on the top of her head, and she let herself be held, fully and without any of her usual careful reserve, and they stood in the September yard for a long moment while Clara watched from what she had apparently decided was an appropriately discreet distance of about 4 feet. They were married at the end of October in 1880 at the small church in Caldwell, in a ceremony that was simple because Hester had no interest in elaborate and Aaron had no objection to simple. Margaret Hoskins and her husband came, and the Whitfields, and a handful of other neighbors who had become genuine friends over the past year of Hester gradually letting the community in. Clara stood beside her mother in a dress that Hester had made from good wool fabric and held a small bunch of late autumn flowers she had picked herself, and the expression on her face throughout the ceremony was one of complete and radiant satisfaction. The minister asked if anyone present had cause to object, and there was a moment of the ordinary, slightly breathless silence that this question always produces, and then he asked Aaron if he took Hester as his wife, and Aaron looked at her with dark eyes that were absolutely certain and said, "I do." And Hester looked at him and felt every year of careful solitude and proud independence exactly right behind her. Not as something to regret, but as something that had made her strong enough to stand here and choose this freely, not out of need but out of genuine want, which was entirely different, and she said, "I do," clearly and without any trembling in her voice. They walked out of the church into the October afternoon with the leaves of the elm trees along the street turning gold above them and Clara between them holding both their hands, and Margaret Hoskins threw a handful of dried grain and herbs, which was the custom, and Hester laughed, really laughed, the kind of laugh that lives in the whole body. The farm was theirs together now, in the honest and practical sense that they ran it together and made decisions together, though the deed remained in her name, and she had been clear about that, and Aaron had never suggested otherwise. He brought his full working knowledge and his wages from subsequent short-term jobs in the off-season to it, and they invested carefully in things that would make the operation more stable. A second proper draft horse to replace aging Pepper when that time came, better equipment for the harvest, a small expansion of the kitchen garden into a genuine market garden that could sell produce to the growing town of Caldwell, which was expanding as the railroad brought more people into southern Kansas. Clara started a new school year and had become, at 7 years old, a person of considerable consequence among her classmates, which pleased her a great deal and caused her mother no particular surprise. She had taken to calling Aaron by his first name from the beginning, and whether or not he would eventually become a more formal figure in her life was something she had considered very seriously, and then, in early November, come to a conclusion about on her own. "I would like to call you Papa," she told him one morning at breakfast, with the directness that was her primary characteristic, "if you do not mind." Aaron set down his coffee cup. He looked at this small person with her mother's eyes and her own relentless honesty, and he felt something large and warm move through his chest. "I would not mind at all," he said. "I would be honored." Clara nodded, as though a business matter had been satisfactorily concluded, and went back to her breakfast. Hester, across the table, was looking at her hands with a slight trembling at the corner of her mouth that meant she was keeping herself from crying, which she mostly succeeded at. That evening when Clara was asleep, Aaron said to Hester quietly, "I know I am not her father, I know Martin was that." "I know you know," Hester said, "and she knows too, she is choosing something. That is different from it just being given to her, and I think it means more to her that way." He nodded, and she leaned against his shoulder, and they sat in the quiet of the kitchen in the good dark of a November evening and listened to the house around them settle. The winter of 1880 into 1881 was a hard one across the Kansas plains, with deep snow in December that isolated the farms for 2 weeks, and then a thaw followed by another freeze that turned everything into ice and made going anywhere treacherous. Aaron and Hester worked the farm through it together, the way they worked everything, side by side and in their established rhythm, and being snowbound together with Clara for 2 weeks in December turned out to be one of the best things that had happened to all three of them. A contained world of the three of them making the best of close quarters, telling stories in the evenings, teaching Clara card games that were suitable for a 7-year-old. Aaron whittling small figures from scraps of wood, because his hands needed occupation, and Clara received each new figure as though it were a great treasure. They were talking, by January, about the future in the most specific terms, about what they wanted the farm to be in 5 years, in 10 years. Hester had ideas about expanding the operation, careful, methodical ideas rooted in her knowledge of the land and the market. Aaron had ideas about livestock, about the possibility of adding sheep to what was currently a purely crop operation, which Hester was skeptical about but willing to discuss. They discussed it over several evenings with the comfortable seriousness of two people who trust each other's judgment enough to argue with it, and who know that the argument is not about winning, but about thinking it through together. In the spring of 1881, Hester knew she was expecting a child. She knew the way a woman knows these things, before she had any certainty from anyone else, and she told Aaron one morning in March while they were both in the barn before dawn, feeding the animals in the pre-light, and he stopped completely in the middle of hanging a feed bucket and looked at her in the dimness, and she watched what moved across his face, which was something profound and careful and full of wonder. "Are you certain?" he said. "Not completely, not yet, but I think so." He came across the barn and held her very carefully, as if she might be more fragile than she actually was, which was not very fragile at all, and she let him and said into his shoulder, "I am not made of glass, Aaron." "I know," he said. "I know you are not." But he held her carefully anyway. The certainty came, and the spring settled into a summer of warm weather and enough rain, a genuine relief after the drought years, and the farm did well. Clara was thrilled about the coming baby in the particular way that children are when they have processed the logistics, and decided they are in favor of the outcome. She had very specific opinions about the baby's name, none of which were solicited, all of which she offered freely. Hester was practical about her pregnancy, as she was practical about everything. She modified her work as was necessary but did not stop working, because the farm did not stop needing work because she was expecting. And she had the sense to rest when she needed to rest without being told, and to ask for help with the heavier tasks, which was easier now than it would have been 3 years ago, because now there was someone to ask and no pride was lost in the asking. Aaron was attentive without being overbearing about it, which was exactly the right calibration and which she had trusted him to find. He took on the heaviest work without comment, and without making her feel that she was being managed, and he was alert to the moments when she was more tired than she was letting on. And on those evenings, he would find something that needed doing in the kitchen so that she could sit without having to justify sitting. The baby was born in November, healthy and loud about it. A boy with a full head of dark hair who arrived on a Tuesday evening with the help of Margaret Hoskins and a midwife from town named Nell Webb, who had been attending Kansas births for 20 years and whose calm competence was the most reassuring thing in the room. Aaron spent the evening in the barn in the tradition of the time, but he was there when Nell Webb came to the door and told him it was done and both mother and baby were well. And the look on his face in that moment was one that Nell Webb would mention to her daughter sometime later as one of the more moving things she had witnessed in her work. They named him James Martin Collier. The Martin was for Hester's first husband, which was Aaron's suggestion, and Hester had looked at him when he suggested it with an expression that contained something she could not say out loud, which was that she had not known it was possible to love someone for their generosity in quite this way. Clara held her new brother with extreme seriousness and looked at him for a long time, and then announced that he was smaller than she had expected, but seemed all right, which was her standard of approval, and which James Martin seemed to accept without complaint. The winter after James's birth was a different kind of winter from all the ones before it, full in a way that previous winters had not been. The farmhouse warm with the particular warmth of a household that has new life in it. The sounds different, shaped by the small and entirely consuming needs of a newborn, and the remarkable resilience of a baby who was, as his mother had suspected he might be, physically sturdy and thoroughly interested in the world from approximately his first week in it. Clara was more helpful than she had ever been, not because she was told to be, but because she wanted to be, carrying things and fetching things and sitting beside the cradle, and talking to her brother in a low, serious voice about everything that was happening in the household, which she apparently felt he should be informed of. The years that followed were good years, genuinely good, not without difficulty, because farming in Kansas in the 1880s was never without difficulty, but good in the ways that counted. There were dry years and wet years, years when the market prices for grain fell and they had to be careful, years when they did well. Aaron continued to take occasional short-term work in the off-season when the pay was right, always returning with wages that went into the farm, and always going and returning by clear agreement with Hester, who had long since stopped feeling anything but straightforward confidence in his comings and goings, because she knew he always came back. The farm grew steadily, the market garden proving as successful as Hester had planned, and by 1884 they had enough stability to make the livestock expansion Aaron had first proposed in 1881, settling on cattle rather than sheep after extensive discussion, and adding a small herd of mixed beef stock that Aaron knew how to manage, and that added a new dimension to the operation. Clara grew up fast in the way of farm children, competent and practical and deeply herself, with her mother's directness and her own particular combination of determination and humor. She was 12 years old in 1885 and had opinions about everything and expressed them clearly, to the general amusement of both her parents and the occasional bewilderment of her teachers, who found her simultaneously impressive and exhausting. She helped with James without being asked, and had established herself as the chief authority on what her little brother was and was not allowed to do, which James accepted with the resigned tolerance of a younger sibling who understands that some hierarchies are simply the shape of the world. James was 4 years old in 1885 and was his father's shadow in the mornings, following Aaron through the barn chores with the dedicated attention of someone absorbing everything about how the work was done. He had his mother's brown eyes and a particular steadiness to him that showed up early, the kind of child who watches more than he speaks and then says, when he does speak, something that turns out to be accurate. Aaron taught him the name of every piece of equipment in the barn by the time he was 4.5, and James used those names correctly, and with the satisfaction of someone who values precision, which made Hester look at Aaron one evening and say, "He gets that from you." Gets what? Caring that the right word is the right word. Aaron considered this. "I learned that words matter from a particular woman in a cornfield," he said. She threw a dish towel at him. In the fall of 1885, Hester discovered she was expecting again, and this time she told Aaron in the kitchen at supper, across the table with Clara listening, because there was no reason to hide it from her daughter, who took the news with the air of someone for whom this was confirming an already held theory. "I thought so," Clara said. "You have been tired." "You are 12 years old," Hester said. "How would you know what I look like when I am expecting?" "I remember with James," Clara said simply, and went back to her supper with the unassailable logic of someone who keeps very careful mental notes on everything. The second baby was a girl, born in May of 1886 in the spring warmth with the kitchen garden already coming up green outside the window and the apple tree in blossom. They named her Louise after Aaron's mother, whom he had not seen in years, and who had written him a letter full of quiet relief when he had written to tell her he was married and settled. The letter of a woman who had worried for a long time that her son was going to drift through the world alone. James, who was 4.5, took the arrival of Louise with considerably less philosophical calm than Clara had taken his arrival, requiring several days of adjustment during which he needed to be reminded fairly often that he was still very important. Aaron handled this by instituting a morning tradition of James coming with him for the first barn rounds, just the two of them, which solved the problem entirely, because James's primary need was simply for that specific father-son time to remain intact, and once he understood that it would, he made his peace with Louise fairly thoroughly, and was occasionally observed sitting near her and talking to her in a low voice in what seemed to be the family tradition. The community of Caldwell had grown considerably since Hester had first farmed her land outside it in the early 1870s. The railroad had brought commerce and new settlers, and the town had a proper main street now with several substantial businesses, a good school that Clara attended and would continue attending through her education, a church, a newspaper, and the social infrastructure of a place that was becoming genuinely established rather than provisional. There were still the hardships and injustices that were woven into the fabric of the frontier, the inequities in how land and opportunity were distributed, the difficulties faced by those who came without resources against those who came with them, the particular challenges that fell hardest on women trying to operate independently in a system that still did not fully credit them with the right to do so. Hester had navigated all of that with the stubborn practical intelligence she brought to everything, and the fact that she had done it alone for years had given her a clarity about it that she did not soften when she talked about it with Aaron or with the other women in her community. She was a voice in her community, had become so gradually and without intending to, simply by speaking directly about what she knew from her own experience, and people had started listening. She was involved in the local effort to establish a lending library in Caldwell in 1886, and in discussions about the school's funding, and in the informal network of farm wives who helped each other through difficult seasons in ways that were never formalized but were entirely real. Aaron was proud of this in the way he was proud of everything about her, quietly, and without making a performance of it. The years built on each other the way good years do, each one adding something without erasing what came before. By 1888, the farm was solid enough that they had repaid everything and owned the land outright and had modest savings at the Caldwell Bank. And Aaron was no longer taking any outside work because the farm itself provided enough and needed him full-time, which was exactly what he had wanted for longer than he had known he wanted it. He was 36 years old and Hester was 35, and they had the ease in each other's company that comes from years of genuine partnership. The ability to communicate in short sentences and looks, and the particular silences that only exist between people who know each other completely. There were the ordinary frictions of a long marriage, the accumulated small disagreements about how things should be done, the tiredness that sometimes made patience shorter than it should be, the moments when two strong-willed people who had each been self-sufficient for a long time had to actively choose the partnership over the individual preference. They had these and they worked through them with the same directness they brought to everything, sometimes heatedly and always honestly, and they came out the other side still knowing each other and still choosing each other, which is how it is meant to work. Clara was 15 in 1888 and had grown into a young woman who was unmistakably her mother's daughter and entirely her own person, with an intellectual sharpness that her teachers noted with a combination of admiration and occasional exasperation, and a social confidence that came from having always been taken seriously at home. She wanted to continue her education beyond what the Caldwell School could offer, and had talked about this with her parents with her usual directness, and they had taken the conversation seriously and were looking at options, because one thing both Aaron and Hester agreed on completely was that Clara would have every opportunity they could give her. James at 7 was a quiet, capable child who had taken to farm work with a naturalness that pleased his father and seemed to come from his own genuine interest rather than from any expectation. He was beginning to read with a seriousness of purpose that made his mother's heart glad, sitting at the table in the evenings with his book and his concentrated frown, refusing to skip a word he did not know, but stopping to ask what it meant, and then using it in a sentence the next day to make sure he had it right. Louise, 2 years old in 1888, was the loudest person in the household, by a considerable margin despite being the smallest, with opinions about every element of her daily life that she expressed at full volume and without reservation. She had Aaron's dark hair and Hester's brown eyes, and a personality that seemed to be entirely her own, a combination of joyful and imperious that kept the family in a state of amused uncertainty about what she was going to do next. One evening in the spring of 1889, Aaron came in from the East Field later than usual, when the supper dishes had already been done, and Clara and James were doing their reading and Louise was already down for the night, and he had the look on his face that meant he had been thinking about something on and off all day and had finally settled on it. Hester had learned to know that look. She poured him coffee and sat down across from him and waited. "I want to say something to you," he said. "All right," she said. He looked at his hands for a moment and then at her. "I was 28 years old when I rode past your fence," he said. "I had been moving since I was 19, working one place and then another and telling myself that suited me. You told me that once," she said. "You said you were less sure." "I was less sure because of you," he said. "I did not know it yet, but I was less sure because there was a woman in a field who was doing everything herself and doing it with everything she had, and something about that stopped me. I have never been able to explain it exactly." "You do not have to explain it," she said. "I want to," he said, "because you deserve to know it. You gave me something I did not know I needed, Hester. You let me be useful. You let me be here. You let me be part of something real." He paused. "I think I fell in love with you that first evening at the fence. I think I fell in love with you before I knew your name." The kitchen was quiet around them, the lamplight warm and steady, the sounds of the children with their books in the other room, the house settling in its familiar way, the spring night breathing softly through the window. "Aaron," Hester said. "Yes." "I was angry at myself for watching you go," she said. "That first morning. I stood on the porch and I watched you ride away and I thought, I am being absurd. I do not even know this man. I told myself that and kept telling myself that, and it did not help at all." He looked at her and his mouth curved in the way she loved best. "Did it not?" "Not even slightly," she said, and got up and went around the table and he pushed his chair back and she sat down in the space it made. sideways on his knee, and put her arm around his shoulders and her head against his temple. And he put his arm around her waist, and they sat like that in the warm kitchen while the night settled in around the farm they had built together. Their children nearby and their land outside and their life in every direction around them, solid and real and good. Louise, who had a 6-year-old's absolute certainty about what was right, declared at breakfast one Saturday in the early summer of 1892 that the farm needed a dog, and made this case to both parents over 2 consecutive meals with the kind of sustained, organized persistence that suggested she had been thinking about it for longer than one day. Aaron, who had the instinct to look at Hester before agreeing to anything of household consequence, looked at Hester. Hester, who had been watching her youngest daughter deploy an argument with the same relentless logic her oldest daughter had always favored, felt that the case had been adequately made. They got the dog. He was a brown and white working dog of no particularly distinguished parentage from a farm family outside of town, already half-grown, and with the working instincts bred into him that made him immediately useful around livestock, which justified the decision practically, even before he proved himself to be the devoted companion that Louise had predicted he would be. Clara named him because naming things was always Clara's prerogative, and she called him Honest, because she said he had an honest face, which nobody argued with. Clara was 19 in 1892 and had, through a combination of her mother's careful savings and a scholarship offered by a teacher's college in Lawrence, Kansas, achieved the continued education she had wanted. She came home for the summers and brought the energy of a young woman discovering the world of ideas at full tilt, and the dinner table conversations when she was home had a particular brightness that everyone in the family thrived on. She had found her calling in teaching, which was not a surprise to anyone who had known her from childhood, and she was going to be remarkable at it. James, 11 years old in 1892, had grown into a tall, quiet boy who was easy in the physical world of the farm and increasingly interested in the world of books and ideas that Clara was bringing back with her. He and his sister had a relationship of the particular richness that a significant age gap allows, when the older sibling has become an adult and can engage the younger one as a genuine peer of intellect if not of experience. And James was beginning to be someone that Clara was as interested in talking with as anyone she met in Lawrence. Louise was the farm's main personality. At 6 years old, a force of cheerful disruption who had wrapped every member of the family around her in different ways and knew it, and used it with a complete lack of shame that they all secretly admired. She could be found at any given time in 5 different places on the farm depending on what was interesting, and she informed everyone of what she had observed at all times, which kept the household fully up to date on the status of the livestock, the progress of the garden, and the activities of the neighboring farms within visible distance. In the summer of 1892, on an evening in July that was almost exactly 13 years after Aaron had first ridden past the fence on the Caldwell Road, he and Hester sat on the porch in the late afternoon, while Louise ran in the yard with Honest, and James was visible in the far field doing some task he had set himself, and the farm lay around them in the summer light in its good and working completeness. And Hester leaned against Aaron's shoulder the way she always did, and he put his arm around her the way he always did, and neither of them said anything for a long while because nothing needed saying. The corn was planted in the field to the east, the same field she had been hoeing alone that July evening when a stranger had tied his horse to her fence without being asked and come to help. The stalks were tall and green, and the field was well tended and healthy, and the sky above it was the enormous Kansas sky that went on forever in every direction, turning amber and rose at the edges as the sun began its daily departure. "Aaron," Hester said. "Yes. That evening you came through the fence." "I remember it clearly," he said. "I thought I did not want help," she said. "I had gotten very good at not wanting things I did not have. And now." She looked at him, at the man who had stopped at her fence on a summer evening and seen her working alone and simply come to help, who had understood without being told what kind of woman she was, and had never once tried to make her into any other kind, who had held her carefully and held Clara's trust, and built his life alongside hers without ever once making her feel that her life was less because it had started without him. "Now I know that wanting is not weakness," she said. "I learned that from a cowboy who tied up his horse at my fence." He smiled, slow and real, his eyes warm with everything that had happened between that July evening and this one. "I learned something from a woman who would not look up from her hoeing," he said. "What did you learn?" "That some things are worth stopping for," he said, "even if you were not planning to stop." Louise chose this moment to appear at the porch steps with Honest at her heels, and something in her cupped hands that she announced was a beetle of unusual size and exceptional qualities. And the moment gave way to the next moment the way moments always do. And Aaron got up to look at the beetle with the serious attention it apparently deserved. And Hester watched him with her elbows on her knees and her chin in her hands, and her heart full of the good and ordinary richness of this life they had built. That was built now, that was finished in the best possible way. Not finished as in ended, but finished as in complete, whole, exactly what it was meant to be. The sun went all the way down over the Kansas plain in its spectacular, unhurried way, painting the sky every color it knew, and the farm was quiet and lit and warm, and the people in it were all exactly where they were supposed to be, which is not a small thing, not in any century, not in any place, but especially not here in the hard and beautiful country of the American West in the last years of the 19th century, where the land asked everything of you, and if you were very lucky and very stubborn and open enough to let the right people in, gave back something that could not be precisely named but that felt, in the quiet of an evening, like everything.